Hello, you're listening to the Vincast, Australia's premier wine podcast. Thank you so much for all the recent support of the podcast. For those of you who have subscribed, shared posts on Facebook, or tweeted me, hit me up on Instagram, or even got in contact via email. I just want to have a couple of shout outs before we start this week's episode. Thanks to Jules Van C and Peter Zakar on Twitter, and Adam Cook, who commented on one of my photos on Instagram. And I also want to do a special shout out to Pippa. Pippa got in contact with me. She works at Hillsmith Family Vineyards, and I actually got to meet her in person last week at a special Jance event as part of the the Melbourne International Garden Flower Show. So thank you so much for the support. I would really love for everyone to get in contact with me. You can find out how to get in contact via intrepidwino.com, but particularly I would love for you to go and subscribe on iTunes to the Vincast and leave me a 5-star rating and a bit of a review, because that really does provide excellent feedback for potential listeners who are wine lovers just like you, but also it provides feedback to potential guests. And I'm very excited about this week's very special episode. On episode 86 of the Vincast, I chat with 3 Willamette Valley, Oregon winemakers. Melissa Burr from Stoller Family Vineyards, Dave Paige from Adelsheim, and Harry Peterson-Nedry from Chehalem. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Garesbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and I hope you did enjoy last week's episode with Judy Chan. It was a really fascinating insight into not only the Chinese wine market, but Chinese wine production, as she was talking about her family's winery, Grace Vineyards, in the Shaanxi region. If you haven't listened to it, I do highly recommend going back and listening to episode 85. I've got a very, very different style of podcast episode for this week. I actually was able to sit down for a very short chat with 3 visiting Oregon winemakers who were here for the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. So this is the third and final Melbourne Food and Wine Festival type interview. I was actually lucky enough to visit all 3 of these fantastic Willamette Valley producers when I visited Oregon in 2011. So in some cases it was great to catch up with some of the winemakers and also to meet one who I hadn't actually met when I visited. So slightly different format. Instead of talking to one person for around 45 minutes, I've got 3 different people to hopefully give you an insight into Oregon wine. So please stick around to the end so you can find out how to get in contact with myself and with each of my guests. But until then, I'll see you on the other side. Melissa, it is wonderful to see you again after over 4 or 5 years when I visited the Stoller Vineyard in Willamette Valley, and I believe this is your first time in Australia, so welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, happy to be here.
How have you found it so far?
Awesome. It's amazing. I mean, it's been fabulous. So much good food. Mm-hmm. Always blending of cultures, nice people. It's gorgeous here in the city. So yeah, I love it. It's a
nice time of year actually. We've had some good weather, particularly yesterday.
Yeah.
And you of course were here for the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. And what was the consensus? Were the Australian Pinots better than the Oregon, or was it the other way around?
They complement each other. They're both beautiful, right? I mean, that's the thing about Pinot. It's reflective of the place, and it's unique to the growing environment, the soil type, the vintage, and the style. So
sure.
I don't know if the verses ever got decided.
I don't like using that concept of verses because it's always going to be different. It's like comparing vintages. Like the vintages are different as well.
Yeah, it's frustrating. It's like here in Oregon, you get a lot of California Pinot is just terrible compared to Oregon, isn't it? Or
Yeah,
vice versa.
yeah.
I'm like, that's really,
And that's personal as
that's
well.
really, yeah, the reflection is unique, and that's what makes it a interesting wine in general and grape. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So how did you first get into the wine industry?
I got into the industry. I grew up in Oregon, and like most people in the Oregon wine industry, I'm a refugee, if you will, of the industry. Where I didn't wake up when I was 5 and say I want to be a winemaker,
No.
or look at the industry, which was emerging. It was only 50 years we've been growing grapes in Oregon, so it's relatively young. But I have a science background, because I was going to I wanted to become a naturopathic doctor, so
Okay.
got my pre-med degree in the late 90s, and at the same time started to really appreciate wine and get intrigued, so
Sure.
decided not to go to graduate school, but instead to go do an internship and see what this wine thing was all about, and loved it. And so
Did you drink wine at all?
I did. That's what got me going, as I started to really develop an interest and a taste for wine, and just thought, wow, there's so much out there. There's so
Sure.
many varietals. It
Sure.
was confusing but intriguing. And
Were you studying in Portland?
yeah, Portland State University.
And is Portland a very parochial wine market? Do they mostly drink Oregon wines, or do they enjoy wines from all over the US and even overseas?
Definitely, it's the second. It's a lot of a lot of a mix, but we
Sure.
are seeing a lot of down home appreciation, if you will, for Oregon wines,
Great.
which is respective. I mean, we're in wine country,
Sure.
so Portland is, a lot of the lists have a quite substantial Oregon component, as they should.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, it is an international focus for most places. It really depends on the restaurant type and such, but
I guess to a certain extent it's a bit different to, say, being in San Francisco, where the wines of California are quite diverse. There's lots of different kind of microclimates, and you can work with Pinot Noir in one region or Zinfandel in another, whereas in Oregon it's predominantly a cooler climate, so there's more Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir, correct?
That's correct. And especially when we're talking about Willamette Valley, a lot of the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Pinot Gris is coming from the northern Willamette Valley, but we
Sure.
do have the southern Oregon component that's warmer. It's kind of the banana belt of the wine region in Oregon,
Sort
we
of
say.
closer
It's
to
sort of-
Eugene?
Yeah, southern, even more south of Eugene.
Okay, yeah.
Yet. So Roseburg and
Yep.
the Umpqua Valley,
Yeah.
and down south, almost to the border of California, even.
Sure.
And that area can ripen quite a diverse amount of varietals,
Okay.
as well as the Columbia Gorge, which is on the Oregon
That's
side of
true,
things.
that's
It's
true,
a
yeah.
huge expanse. So it depends. I mean, Oregon's it's got a broad range of things, but it is really known for the northern Willamette Valley, for the cool climate, growing conditions.
That's
and
sort of, and that's
it
where
is.
the quality wine is coming from, correct?
Yeah, that's where the bulk of the wines are coming from. You can
Sure.
find lovely wines from all the other places, but just the density of wineries and vineyards are located in that northern area,
Yeah.
and it's a cool climate. It's temperate and really conducive to growing world class Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Pinot Gris and such.
So did you kind of find a love of the Oregon wines, particularly Willamette wines, before you started working, like to have your first kind of internship in a winery?
Honestly, no. It was after. I mean, I fell in love with Zinfandel and then
Really?
Cabernets,
Okay.
and I liked warmer climate wine. I liked California, big reds, and
Yeah.
even Malbec, and just these big kind of clunky wines. They're
Sure.
still lovely. I mean, you can find lovely wines from all over the place, all over the world. Obviously,
Wines that you can taste, in inverted commas.
yeah, that's right. I liked those, and then
Less elegance.
less elegance and a lot of obviousness, and then just kind of went through. And I love to cook, and I like science, I like art, but I like the hands-on process of winemaking. So started to make Pinot Noir and really just fell in love with it through the process and just tasting and going forward.
Yeah, okay. So where was the first place you interned at?
I interned at a winery called Cooper Mountain Vineyards, which is in Beaverton, just outskirts of Portland, and
Okay.
they farm organically and biodynamically. So I was very drawn to them for my first internship out
Are there a
of
lot
college.
of hipsters in Beaverton?
There's a lot of hipsters in Portland. I don't know. Beaverton's a suburb of Portland, but yeah. You'll find hipsters kind of. There's per person in Oregon. I think it's more concentrated in the urban setting, which
Sure.
the further away they get, the statistics get lower. But yeah, you find
Yep.
those big beards and the tight pants and stuff, around town.
So were you having the opportunity to use some of the science studies you'd kind of gained, or some the science you had studied as far as working in the winery, or was it all very kind of hands-on, and did you kind of get into that side of thing?
It was definitely both. I mean, this science background that I have was enabled me to be able to progress. I took some advanced fermentation science courses that I understood, and I think that's critical fundamentally to making wine, to really understand those processes to a degree. I mean, you can really go off on as much depth of information as you'd like and research and such, but the science background was critical, and then the art of it and the understanding and working with vintage and agriculture, and then becoming a semi-mechanic, which I still don't like. I mean, one of the things that drives me most crazy, even after I've been at the same winery for 13 years, is the damn fittings. Like, this piece connects to that, and it's just metric and all this junk and metal connections. I'm like, this just drives me bananas. So you have to have a little bit of that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So, at what point did you kind of say, "No, this is what I want to do. This is going to be my career"?
Probably right when I got into it. I loved that first harvest at Cooper Mountain. I kind of go with the flow, and I think there's a lot of things you can do with your life, and don't necessarily see like pigeonholing like one thing. Like, I'm always going to be a winemaker, but I loved making wine and the process, and I think it's such an interesting lifestyle because it's the winemaking, it's agriculture, it's people, it's vintage, it's travel, it's food. I mean, it's all kind of part of it. It's commerce. Business. There's a lot of exploration and intrigue and
you get
knowledge.
To meet lots of interesting people as well, like people who come all the way from Australia.
Like people like you that travel the whole world and come visit Stoller, and you get to visit places like Australia. So
So tell me a little bit about the journey that brought you to Stoller Vineyard.
Well, the journey that brought me to Stoller was being in Oregon and making a couple of vintages. And Oregon has been known and still is known for a lot of collaboration and networking. Yeah. Smaller industry, and it's really a pioneering state. We're
very community focused.
Very community focused, and especially in the wine industry. And we get that commentary a lot. I do personally from visitors from other places. It's like, wow, you guys really seem to work well together. And it seems like you guys share information and work. We have a lot of group tastings and activities and such. And I think that
there's a big Pinot Noir conference, for example.
Yeah, the International Pinot Noir Conference celebration is huge. And it is held in McMinnville, Oregon, which is the heart of wine country. And it's phenomenal. It brings producers from all over the world to showcase their Pinot Noirs, and the best chefs of the state, and educators and people come from all over the world to talk and to teach courses. And the consumers that go to this event are really enriched by everything Pinot Noir. Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about Stoller Vineyard itself, whereabouts it is in the Willamette Valley itself? Because that's one of the things that I was reminded of when I was there, when I was reading back on my blog, is that from one side to the other, it's a good hour's drive at least. So tell me a little bit about Stoller.
Sure. Yeah, that is true. What you were saying about driving from one side to the other can be stretched. The Willamette Valley itself is quite large. It takes up a really good chunk of Oregon itself as a state. It's about 300 miles long from tip to tip. It starts up north of Portland and goes down a little south of Eugene, Oregon. And the kind of the epicenter for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and such is focused on the northern part of the Willamette Valley, and where Stoller is located is in the northern section. And it's by car, if you're in Portland, Oregon, it's about 45 minutes drive, maybe an hour if you have some traffic. And we're another hour east of the coast. So if you get in the car and drive west an hour, you're at the coast of Oregon. And Stoller is located in the bottom piece of the Dundee Hills AVA. So what we've done, we have numerous AVAs that we've identified in the Willamette Valley, and we're still doing so to parse up that big region. And Dundee Hills is one of them. And the Dundee Hills is about 80,000 acres. So it looks like an island of hills if you're looking at it from above. And everything above 200 feet in this chunk of hillside is predominantly volcanic soil. So Stoller is on the side of the Dundee Hills, and it's almost a 200-acre planting of vineyard. It's a 400-acre property, all one contiguous hillside, volcanic soil, planted at southeast facing, and it's lovely. It's Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, predominantly, those two. And then we have a very small amount of Riesling and a couple other varietals as well on the property that we play around with just for fun, but really focused on Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
So as far as the work in the vineyard, is there a particular philosophy?
Yeah, we do. We have a very sustainable philosophy, and our vineyard manager, Rob Schultz, has been with us for over 4 years now, and he's just dedicated to making the property A, sustainable, and B, getting to know all the nuances of each individual section of the vineyard. I can't even talk anymore. But each section.
I'm sure it's just the jet lag.
Yeah, it's, of course. I have to blame it on the jet lag. Of 200 acres, there's over 90 sections of fruit that differ by variety, clone, elevation, rootstock, and they're unique amongst themselves. So it's really to hone in on the components and then treat the property holistically and very sustainably.
And are you trying to kind of isolate as many different parcels as you can when you bring it into the winery?
Yes, that's been the philosophy that I've had since I started, is to really try to study this different sections, particularly with the Pinot Noir, and ferment the sections independently as their own group and put to the barrel as well.
Yeah.
But over the years, we're starting to understand kind of from the gates what we want to produce. And so now it's more about, okay, where do we want to make these certain tiers of wines from, and so sometimes that will lead to combining sections.
Okay.
But it is just having that vision of what style of wine do we want to make, what tiers is going to go to, what's the goal, and how do these sections perform, and what do we want to really push them to do. So it's definitely a lot of individualized looking and mapping and planning before we even start the growing season.
So how do you keep them separate in the cellars, and at what point do you start thinking about blending if necessary?
Sure. In the cellars, we keep them separate by fermentation tank for one. We'll pick sections and keep them as independently as we can within these tanks and ferment them. And then we put them then in their own barrel groups and just keep it separate for the most part. Most of all of our reserves are done that way and our smaller cuvées. And now our larger blends of Dundee Hills, sometimes I'll combine a couple sections. So I like the components of them combined. So it's the knowledge of what we want to make, and it's taken a lot of time to know the vineyard, know what we want to do from it, and then kind of have that vision for where do you combine, where do you leave it apart. But it's easily done if you want to by keeping the wines in their own fermentation tank and then going to barrel separately and just tracking it all year long in barrel and blending at the end of the season.
Do you have a philosophy as far as working with barrels? New, old, large, small? Yeah,
definitely. Barrels are such a huge part of making wine, and they're an art in themselves with the production of barrels and what the flavor impact they offer and why you're using them and what you're trying to attain from the barrels.
Yeah.
So barrels to me are like spices. It's like if you're making a soup, maybe one kind of soup, you want a little bit more, maybe a lot of paprika and a lot of black pepper and a lot of strong spices, but maybe you want something more delicate to focus on, like this beautiful like spring carrot, and you want it to be really fresh. So you use different spice and a little bit less. And that's why I look at the wines is, what's the goal? I think oak is a very beautiful accent to wine. I think it's a perfect partnership when done right, but it has to be in balance. So long-winded answer is we use oak for all of our Pinot, for our barrel fermented Chardonnay as well. Predominantly French oak, a tiny bit of Hungarian oak, but it's the right seasoned. It's the right grain structure for the delicate variety that Pinot Noir is.
Sure.
That expensive French oak. But it depends on what blend it is. So, for instance, we make some small legacy tier blends that are really just cellar door, tasting room, sales wines or wine club.
Yeah.
And some of them, they're very styled. So one of them, for instance, I'll use almost 100% new oak with this blend because I'm using a part of the vineyard that's planted to a clone called Pommard. And it tends to be very dark and have beautiful tannins and a really earthy presence and a lot of depth and expression and kind of a lot of concentration. So I use a lot of oak with that, and it's beautiful.
Sure.
Where another section might be, like, let's say, a Wädenswil clone, but it comes from Switzerland originally.
Okay.
And that tends in our vineyard to be very red fruited and spicy and have a little bit more natural acidity and length to it. And I like quite a bit less oak with that section. So It just really, again, depends on what you're trying to create.
It's about balance at the end of the day.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
So is it dangerous to kind of categorize Dundee Hills Pinot Noir in a certain way? Are they all quite different, or is there kind of a typicity to Pinot Noir from Dundee Hills?
I think that there is a typicity to the Dundee Hills that we study that too. As the AVA, we do tastings every year. We do all the AVAs host tastings, and we do a lot of this looking at soil types and what it does to the wine. And the Dundee Hills, to me, is characterized by the fact that it's an island of hills that's almost all volcanic soil from 200 feet and above on these hillsides that the grapes are planted on. It's quite temperate. The region, the northern Willamette Valley, is a temperate growing, cooler growing region, but the Dundee Hills in particular are quite protected because we've got the western foothills to the coast, mountain ranges, that it kind of buffer a lot of the storms that come in and the wind and some of the heavier rain. And then to the north we have the Chehalem mountain range, which does the same thing. Sure. And we have the Cascades. So it's warm. The nighttime temperatures are a little bit warmer than some other regions or AVAs in the valley. And the soil, the volcanic soil, can be quite deep in parts as well. So the roots of the vines, I think, have an easy time just kind of going through this well-draining, silty, volcanic soil without a lot of struggle or some other...
A bit different to clay.
Yeah, different to clay, and just a lot of depth to that, and a lot of kind of powdery material for those roots to stretch out. So long-winded again answer, the Dundee Hills, to me, you get a lot of this fine-grained tannin because of those factors, I believe. So it's the beautiful kind of silky tannin, and then you get so nice fruit, anywhere from red to darker fruits depending on the vintages, and an earthiness to the wines, and also a bit of cola, just like a note. It's a very slight note, beautiful though, of cola in the Dundee Hills, and spice. So when I taste a wine where it kind of lighter on its feet with the tannins, a spiciness to it, a little bit of that fruit component, you can you pick it out in a tasting of Oregon wines at times. This is Dundee Hills.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And of course, the Stoller wines are available in Australia.
Yes.
That's part of the reason why you're here to show them. And so I would heartily recommend people seek them out. Now, are you on social media at all yourself, or are there Stoller accounts that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Stoller Family Estate has a Facebook page. We've got our website as well. We can do... there's a lot of information on the website. We're on Instagram. Stoller Wine is on Instagram. But yeah, I would definitely encourage any of those. I mean, we're active in all three. And
Excellent.
Connect, and like us on Facebook, and you'll learn a lot about us. And
fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time. It was great to catch up.
Oh, it was wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Dave, thank you very much for joining me upstairs here at the lovely Duke of Windsor here in sunny Melbourne at the moment. And thank you for being on the Vincast.
Thanks for having me.
I would love to know what it was that brought you to the world of wine.
Well, I was studying any number of various things at Ohio State University, which is where I'm from, Ohio. Not a wine culture there of note, at least there wasn't when I was growing up there.
No.
And I sometimes liked things that were scientific and nerdy, and sometimes liked things that were creative and artistic.
Sure.
And
engaging with both the right and left side of the brain.
Exactly. And I got a job in a wine shop, and immediately was attracted to the combination of the two that it offered. I did end up then leaving school and going out to University of California at Davis.
Okay.
And got a winemaking degree there.
Sure.
And been enjoying it ever since. It's not the kind of thing that you learn entirely in a university, of course. So I'm not trying to give Davis too much credit, because you really have to go learn.
It's quite funny that you'd say that, because many of my Australian winemaking guests on the podcast have talked about studying winemaking at universities in Australia and kind of said, it was great, but I don't really use much that I learnt there in what I'm doing now. So if you could be honest, as far as what you do now, how much of it comes into play from what your studies were?
I'll tell you the most important thing to me from my studies. If you approach your studies correctly, what they give you is a filter with which to judge all the things you see when you get out in the world.
Sure.
And to me, the role of having a good, decent scientific background is that I know how to spot dumb ideas perhaps a little quicker than if I didn't have that background.
Sure.
I can shoot holes in people's faulty arguments a little better than if I didn't have that background.
Find flaws in theory.
And that saves me time. And in this business, that's very critical, because, if you brew beer and you make a mistake, you could try again the next day. In winemaking, we get 30 vintages or so in our life to really be a key decision maker about what's going to happen. And how many of them do you want to waste on a dumb idea that you might have been able to figure out was dumb sooner?
Sure.
So that to me is the real role of that background. That's what it does.
And what was the sort of the first move out of UC Davis?
I ran the lab at Sterling for 3 years in the Napa Valley. And then I actually did a harvest at Saltram's in the Barossa Valley.
Really?
Yeah, I worked
So this is not your first time in Australia?
It's not. No, I worked under a guy named Dave Norman, who was a great guy at Saltram's. And it's not my first time in Melbourne either. I drove out to Melbourne after that and checked out the Yarra Valley. Honestly, I didn't know much about growing Pinot Noir, at least, in any other place here other than the Yarra Valley.
Okay.
So what's really exciting about coming back is seeing all of this Mornington Peninsula and Geelong and all this other stuff. It's very exciting.
So did you have particular tastes in wine at that point? Were you drinking a lot of Californian wine, for example, when you were studying and when you were working there?
I think I was, at that point in my career, I was still kind of all over the place.
Sure.
I didn't realize that I was gravitating towards cool climate and in particular Pinot Noir stuff until one time a few years later I was working in the Salinas Valley, and I decided I was going to look for another job, and I found myself just never getting around to sending resumes toward anyone who was only doing Cabernet.
Yeah. And
I realized, I guess I'm trying to be a cool climate winemaker.
Okay.
And so I was maybe the last to know. So I was leaning in that direction. But
you happen to mention someone's like, we've sort of known for a long time, Dave.
Yeah. There's just something so much more nuanced and balanced and elegant about wines that come from cooler climates to me.
Yeah.
And the challenge is, if you get just a little bit more cool of a climate, now you're not going to ripen grapes. And so that's that why finding that sweet spot where you can ripen Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris and varieties like those, but you don't ripen them too fast so that they end up less flavorful and less bright. And those are hard spots to find, and they can pull it off here in Victoria in some areas, and we can pull it off in the Willamette Valley.
Do you feel that you kind of took something a little away from your experience in Australia? Was it a little bit different to what you'd experienced in the United States?
Everything gives you a little bit of a different take. So I saw some things at Saltram's that I never would have thought of before, and just going around looking at other places. Like I remember going over to Henschke, where they use these boards to sink the cap during fermentation. Yeah, I'd never seen that in the United States. That was all new to me. So you get these different ideas, some of which you employ, some of which you don't, but they all stick with you and make you wonder, is there something I can do to employ that or to mimic that?
So what was the first step in the path towards cool climate winemaking?
Well, when I moved back to the States after working at Saltram's, I got a job in the Salinas Valley in Monterey County. Mm-hmm. And that's a fairly cool climate, but in an interesting way, in a fairly strange way. All in one county, you can go from extremely hot, the kind of territory you would only dare plant Zinfandel or something in, to stuff that's too cold to ripen anything. And it's all about how close you are to the ocean there.
Okay. And
if you shelter yourself enough from the ocean, you're extremely hot. If you're not sheltered at all from the ocean, you're too cold to ripen. And so you end up finding your sweet spot just by putting yourself the right distance from the ocean. And that's something that is also true of the Willamette Valley. So that kind of modulating how cool or whatever we are. The Willamette Valley is separated from the Pacific Ocean, which is even colder up north in Oregon than it was down in California, by this range of mountains that probably averages around 700, maybe 800 meters high.
Okay.
And if they were higher mountains, we would be as hot as Napa Valley. If they were lower mountains, we wouldn't even ripen wine grapes. They just happen to be the right height to modulate that cool air coming over.
Yeah.
So that we can be cool and grow great Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Pinot Gris and Riesling, but we're not so hot. You know, we can be cool enough to do that, but we're not so hot or so cool that those become bad ideas.
What was it that brought you to the Willamette Valley?
Liking the wines already. You know, I'd come up and tasted with other Oregon winemakers. I had a few friends up there, and I'd come up and tasted with them and really could see what they were onto. Those wines were brighter, they were higher in acid, but in a way that I didn't automatically realize how important that was. The role of acidity in cool climate wines is so key, but it doesn't always occur to you until you really think about it, that this is what gives those wines this vibrant side, the fresh fruited side. That, instead of going down the slippery slope towards jamminess, or pie filling or those kinds of flavors.
Sure.
And a lot of that is the fact that it's retained its acidity and it stays more like you're biting into fresh fruit.
Sure.
And that to me is simply more refreshing. It's an extremely delicious thing to happen, but it's also you can reveal a lot of complexity that way.
Sure.
Because in the end, there's nothing terribly complex about pie filling.
No, it's delicious, but
yeah,
far from compelling.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the first job in the Willamette Valley?
I moved up to be the winemaker at Adelsheim. It's the only job I've ever had in the Willamette Valley.
There you go. How long have you been making wines there? 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit about Adelsheim. I think it was, from memory, it's one of the first was the first in that sub-region?
It was, technically speaking, the first winery built in the Chehalem Mountains.
Yeah.
There were a few people there before David, in the Willamette Valley in general, but my definition of a pioneer is anyone who got there so early that they were probably a little bit wacky to try it.
There's plenty of wacky people in Oregon.
And David was certainly wacky to try it. And, so he's been there since the early 70s. And I had the opportunity, when I talked to him in 1980, when I talked to him in 2001, to talk to him about what he always liked in wine and what he always, what kind of wines he admired. And they were the same kind of wines I admired. We were both looking for finesse. We were both looking for complexity. Mm-hmm. And I had by then realized that I was going to probably find that in wines like Pinot Noir in cool climates. And he certainly had already realized that, and that's why he was based out of there. So I felt like he needed to hear more of my winemaking expertise, and I could bring something like that to Adelsheim. But for me, I was happy to put my winemaking expertise to the role that I felt it was best suited for, and to make the kind of wines that I really wanted to make all along.
Do you know how much the Adelsheim vineyards had changed from when you started to when they were actually first established?
Well, when I got there, some of the vineyards had just been planted. Some of the other vineyards were already quite old. The ones that were already quite old, we've done some changes to in the time I've been there.
Yeah.
Interesting take on why old vines are prized so highly is that if you had old vines and they didn't make good wine, someone already ripped them out and replanted. So by now, any vines we have that are 30 years old or more are very special because we would have replanted them by now.
Yeah.
And we do have some very special old vine blocks. We also have some very young stuff that I'm very excited about too, some of which we planted since I got there. Some was planted about the same time. So we're always looking for ways to improve our vineyards. And sometimes that means ripping out vines and trying over. Sometimes it means grafting to a different clone or a different variety. Sometimes it means identifying a new site and using all of the knowledge you've gained in your other farming endeavors to try to figure out what would be the great thing to grow at that site.
So, is there one or are there more than one vineyards that provide fruit for Adelsheim?
We farm ourselves, and I apologize because it does change a little bit every year because we've added more over the years. But,
Sure.
Depending on when you ask me, anywhere between 12 and 14 sites.
Sure.
We do buy some fruit, but generally from vineyards that we have very special relationships with.
Yep.
So we have a very lovely block that we get Chardonnay from Stoller's Vineyard.
Okay.
And we still get a block of fruit from Winderley Vineyard in the Dundee Hills. And in both of those cases, we have gotten every single vintage off of those blocks. We started getting that block when it was a baby, and here we are in both cases something like 12 to 14 years later.
Yeah.
Still the only people who make wine from that block.
Yeah.
So we think of, it's not our vineyard, but we have the same sort of proprietary thought about it, and we put the same amount of care into it. And so we do buy some fruit, but our own vineyards are spread out along the northern part of the Willamette Valley that we call the Chehalem Mountains. Mm-hmm. And we have these different elevations, different soils, and so they really come in tasting quite different. And as a winemaker, it's very exciting for us to be growing in all these different sites and have these very different qualities to be able to work with.
So what can you tell me a little bit about sort of the proportions of different grape varieties that you work with? Like how much is Pinot Noir, how much might be Chardonnay, how much might be Pinot Gris, that kind of thing?
Well, Pinot Noir is always going to be king in the Willamette Valley, and for a very good reason. I think it's the wine grape that most often fails if you try to grow it in a place that isn't suited to it.
Sure.
So when you have a place that is suited to it, it's really going to be important. Mm-hmm. And the Willamette Valley is certainly that place, and it certainly is important. But the second biggest variety has always been Pinot Gris. We've always done a lot of Pinot Gris, and that's true for the whole valley, not just Adelsheim. The difference is that Chardonnay is now really starting to take a bigger and bigger role. That's
really exciting because I remember looking back on my notes on my blog from when I was in the Willamette. I kind of thought, I'm surprised not to see more Chardonnay. So that's really good to hear because I thought like some of the Chardonnays that I tasted were really fantastic in my opinion.
I think it's one of those things where maybe some of the earlier efforts didn't turn out as well as they'd hoped for one reason or another.
Sure.
And so it just made it a little bit longer of a time before anybody really went and tried to make it better. And, they finally, partly with the introduction of these Dijon clones that David Adelsheim helped bring over from France, and partly just by doing a little bit better job of identifying great sites, we managed to improve the definition of Chardonnay in Oregon. And so you're starting to see, as the learning curve gets higher and higher, you're starting to see people getting really excited about it.
Right.
And we're realizing it really is a great white wine in Oregon, which, as you said, only makes sense. It's a cool climate. Why wouldn't Chardonnay shine there as it shines in Burgundy and other areas that have genuine cool climates?
Yeah, of course.
And so we're very excited about it now. I don't know what year, but sooner or later it will overtake Pinot Gris as the most planted white variety. I feel confident that eventually it will. And we also make a little bit of Pinot Blanc, by the way.
Okay.
I don't know that the world is begging us to plant a lot more Pinot Blanc, but it makes a lovely wine.
Yeah, I don't see much of it in Australia either. And as far as the wine making, I think from memory there's some sparkling wine produced as well.
We are starting to dabble with sparkling wine. We don't have one released yet.
Okay.
It's all entourage, but we're very excited about the potential for the program.
Great. So tell me a little bit about kind of the way you work as far as having the fruit coming in, and then the way you like to work in the cellars.
To me, I think the hallmark of Adelsheim is that we are always, as fruit's coming in the door, we're always deciding as if from scratch what the best thing to do with it is. We're always willing to say, yeah, that plan we had, it's no good because I want to try something else with this.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you don't necessarily have an end goal in mind and then try and mold it. You kind of look at the fruit and go, okay, let's try this.
I would rephrase that. What I would say is we do have an end goal in mind. The end goal is complexity.
Okay.
And the way to get there is what changes.
Sure.
The route to that end goal changes based on the fruit.
Okay.
And sometimes you look at the fruit or you taste some of the fruit again and you think, I have a different idea than I thought I was going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me is really a hallmark of making wine at Adelsheim. If you're on my team, you get used to the idea that sometimes we just keep we rewrite the rule book.
You want flexible people.
We taste something and we decide, you know what, it doesn't taste the way I thought, and that means I'm going to make a different decision than I made yesterday.
Sure.
And I think that we should be that way as winemakers. We shouldn't be so strictly adhering to whatever we thought we were going to do that we would keep on doing it even in the face of evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I certainly hope you have enjoyed returning to Melbourne after some years, and I'm sure it's been great to sort of reconnect with some of the local wines here, and of course it's been fantastic to have you on the Vincast. Would you like to possibly share with the listeners any social media accounts that you'd like them to follow for the winery or perhaps for yourself?
Well, I'm terrible at social media. I do actually have a Twitter account, but I post very little on it because I go through life assuming that most of what I do is not interesting to most people. But
Have you seen Twitter? That's mostly Twitter.
Well, I agree, but that doesn't mean I have to join that fray.
Sure.
But that's at AVPino. Then Adelsheim has a Twitter account that I honestly can't remember the name of, but I'm sure someone could look it up.
I'll share it
quite easily. But no, other than that, the thing that I think is very special about being in Australia is not just seeing Melbourne again and reminding myself what a great city it is, and tomorrow we'll go up to Sydney and that sort of thing, but also the interaction between the wineries that you have here and the wineries that we have in Oregon.
Yeah.
Almost every year we have at least one Australian working vintage for us in our cellar. And I've worked vintage in Australia, and this summer at the International Pinot Noir Celebration, we have, I think, 6 different Victoria and Tassie wineries coming to pour Pinot Noir, and another half a dozen or so that are sending Pinot Noir for a master class we're hosting up there. So I think that's, it's not just the Willamette Valley all getting together to make sure we're as good as we can be. It's almost all cool climate regions around the globe band together to really reinforce to one another about how to be the best they can be.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and
thank you.
Wish you the best in Sydney.
Thank you for having me.
Harry, thank you very much for making some time in your, no doubt, very busy schedule here in Australia, showing your wonderful Oregon wines. And, of course, it is lovely to see you again after many years when we very randomly met when I visited the Chehalem tasting room in Newburgh.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to get down here to some warm weather and to Australia in general. I love Melbourne. I love the fact that I can sit down. You were very appealing because you've got a nice bench here to sit on.
Yes,
and
it is a nice little
chatting about wine never gets old.
Now, of course, I was very lucky enough to be able to listen in on a wonderful tasting that you hosted with Brian Crozer. Mm-hmm. Sorry, my mind went a bit blank there. As part of the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival, talking about the West Coast being the best coast, and so we of course tasted some incredible wines, including one of your own. So I just wanted to say thank you for that opportunity as well.
Well, I appreciated having somebody that I knew there besides Brian, so that was good. And I don't know who came up with the West Coast as the best coast, but maybe it's just the best coast in the U.S.
Yeah. You don't really see much wine on the East Coast, though, do you?
No.
Please, Harry, tell me, how did you kind of first start getting interested in wine and thinking about maybe making wine essentially your life and your career?
It definitely isn't something I've thought about since I was 10 years old or anything, because I grew up in the south of the United States.
Okay.
And in an area that's fairly religious, which there doesn't mean you drink wine for Sunday dinner.
It's part of what they call the Bible Belt?
You've got it, yes. And so the first alcohol I had cross my lips, I was a senior in university.
Wow.
So it was not something that I aspired to from an early
Does that
time.
mean you were actually of legal drinking age?
I was, believe it or not. It's kind of stupid, isn't it? But when I got out of the university, I decided that I would try a lot of things that I hadn't tried before. And
Sure.
one of the things that kept cropping up in literature growing up, and I was a voracious reader, and in addition to getting my degree in chemistry,
Yeah.
which has helped in the winemaking side of things and in the technical side, I also got a degree in English literature,
Really?
because I
Interesting.
had just read so much. And a lot of things that cropped up in literature had to do with the complex aspects of cultural life, and wine many times was a part of that. So I said, hey, let's find out what all the mystery is. And I became so enamored that in several years later, when I was out on the West Coast, I decided to get into wines that were being now grown in the area I was in, Oregon.
Yeah. So you just happened to end up in Oregon?
I was there because, well, let's be candid. I followed a woman there. Come on, we all follow men or women to various places.
Yeah.
So I was there. I was collecting wine, but it was wine from Europe and from California.
Yeah.
But then the industry was just beginning. This was in the 70s.
Yeah.
And so I decided to look for a vineyard property.
Wow. That you sort of you began your discovery of wines and trying wines from different parts of the world, and that was kind of when you said, "This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to buy some land and plant a vineyard."
Yeah, because you never have enough things to do with all of your idle time. And I had 2 new kids, and I had a job that took about 60 hours a week, so I needed something else to kill time.
Okay.
He said facetiously.
What an incredible happenstance that you just happened to be in Oregon. Were you living in Portland at the time?
I was living in Portland.
Okay.
Yes, and so the wine industry in the northern Willamette Valley is not far from Portland.
Sure.
It's
I'm
within
well
about
aware,
half an hour.
It's not unlike the Yarra Valley and Melbourne.
Yep, totally.
And or the Barossa in Adelaide. So when you kind of thought about establishing, a property in a vineyard in the Willamette, was there much there already at that point?
At that point, because I started looking in '79, and was able to locate what I thought was going to be a very nice piece of property in 1980.
Yeah.
At that point in time, I'll have to look back at my records, but if I'm not mistaken, there were like 40 wineries.
Sure.
And there was less than 1,000 acres of grapes in the valley.
A bit different now.
Yeah, we're 25,000 acres or more, 25 to 30,000 acres, and just in the northern Willamette Valley, about 600 wineries.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, a lot of growth, but for a good reason. It's because of that climate that's there. It's a cool climate, even in global climate change days, we still can grow things there that demand elegance and being treated sensitively.
Yeah. So how did you go about the task of kind of finding your slice of heaven, as it were?
I could give you a whole line of BS that said it was all technical rigor and hunting for the right degree days and things like that. Some people, like the David Letts of our region, had already put in a lot of work in making sure that we were in the right climatic location and the soils were okay.
Yeah.
What I then did was ask somebody who had a general view of farmland around and who knew what vineyards should be to take my profile of what I thought would be perfect and go out and find me some property.
Okay.
And
As far as availability, was it? I would think that probably land would be a lot more expensive now.
it definitely is a lot more expensive. I still was accused of having paid a ridiculously high amount for an acre of land. I paid $3,000 an acre.
Wow.
Back in 1980. It's now about $50,000 an acre. So in relative terms, it might have been expensive then, but there are a lot of people who appreciate what's there now and are willing to pay a lot of money for that.
So you got your site?
Yeah.
What were the decisions made about, how much you wanted to plant and what varieties or what clones you wanted to use?
Obviously, I don't think anybody has come into the Willamette Valley and thought about doing a vineyard without saying Pinot Noir.
Of course.
So any winery that's a winery in the Willamette Valley makes a Pinot Noir.
Was there, at that point, was there much recognition for Oregon Pinot Noir around the world?
There was only a recognition in the minds of those people who were either in the industry in Oregon or were in knowledgeable arenas within the trade. And that had to do with finding a place that was like Burgundy. And a lot of people kind of nodded their head when they said, yeah, this might actually work. There was beginning to be some recognition about, not at the time I started looking for land, but before I actually closed on my piece of property. There was a tasting that was rather seminal in recognition of Oregon, and especially for Pinot Noir.
The equivalent of the 1976 tasting, for example?
Right, and that for California for Stag's Leap and Montelena. But in this one, it was an Irie Pinot Noir from 1975, their South Block, that ended up besting the who's who of Burgundies in a Gaume tasting. And this was in 1980. And it turned out so well that made a lot of people perk up their ears and start paying attention. Yeah.
I seem to remember that kind of one of the big explosive catalysts for investment in the area was when the Duron estate, from Burgundy, established a winery.
Right. And actually the several of the wines that were emphasized in this tasting in Paris that Irie served well were Drouhin wines.
Wow.
And because of that, Robert Drouhin took note of it and was interested a little bit later, especially when his daughter Veronique said, I want to go work in some wine region somewhere. And he pointed her to Oregon, and she came and worked in Oregon for a couple of our friends there, and went back. And not long after that, Robert put out the "Find me a piece of property," and one or two of our friends said, "There's this piece of property that you should be interested in," and even long distance, they signed on the dotted line for that piece of property. Yeah, that became Domaine Drouhin, Oregon.
So from the original kind of purchase and then establishment of the property to the release of the first Chehalem wine, there's a bit of a gap, quite a few years. Tell me about the story of taking it from establishment to releasing your first wine.
It takes a while for vines to come up and become number one, productive,
Yep.
and number two, good quality. Early on, my wife and I decided that we would wait a little bit longer than normal, mainly because she was one of two recognized wine writers in Oregon at the time. And because of that, I said, okay, I'll give you 5 years longer, to where it doesn't embarrass you that I'm going out and trying to grow grapes and make wine.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, and also to allow the vines to get more mature, I decided that in 1990 would be the first vintage of a Chehalem wine, Chehalem being the name that we appropriated from some of the geography around the area that we were growing grapes. And so we waited until 1990. During that period, I, of course, didn't just sit on my heels. I, because of my technical background, I did a lot of work on experimentation and statistical methods, experimentally designed experiments. And I used the same techniques I used in high-tech industry to elucidate what the key factors were in making great Pinot Noir.
Melissa, who was previously speaking with me, talking about one of the things she loves about the northern Willamette Valley is that it's very collaborative, it's very community focused. Did you find that it was, you could ask for advice or, go and spend some time at, one of the neighbours' wineries to kind of learn a little bit about that sort of thing? Did that kind of help?
It definitely is the most collaborative industry, the wine industry in general, and especially in Oregon. Collaboration is kind of our second name. I definitely did one or two harvests before my vines were even planted. I planted in the spring of '82. I did a harvest in 1981. At Amity, I did a harvest in 1982 at Elk Cove. I did a harvest in 1983 elsewhere. And I began doing experimental wines using some of the techniques that I had, some of those from other people's grapes, and then some from my own when we began harvesting finally in 1985. Collaborative, you bet it is. I remember one year, once we had begun a winery, and I had purchased this press from France on a visit over there, and I had it shipped over, and then I realized that the electrical system obviously is going to be different.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And here we have harvest coming real soon. And I happened to mention that to Dick Erath, and Dick is an electronics engineer. We all have careers prior to getting into the wine business.
Sure.
And he said, hey, I'll come over and take a look at it. And so here I was beginning in this winery with this new press. And here's Dick Erath, one of the pioneers from, a decade or so before then, underneath the press, changing out the electrical system so that I could get up and running.
Wow.
Are we collaborative? You bet your ass we are. And I think we all pay it back too. The number of hours and days and weeks and years spent cumulatively by a lot of us in the industry to help the industry in general excel can't be overstated.
So apart from Pinot Noir, can you tell me a little bit about what you are very excited about, particularly as far as the Chehalem wines?
We are as much a white wine winery as we are a Pinot Noir winery.
Yeah.
And that sounds stupid if nothing else, considering the reputation of Oregon's Willamette Valley for Pinot Noir. But white wine and some of the grape varieties that we make wine out of require the same sort of delicate, subtle nuanced climate that Pinot Noir does.
Sure.
And so Riesling is the white wine equivalent of Pinot Noir, in my opinion. It ages, it is transparent to terroir. It ends up being a perfect food wine. All of those things you can say about Pinot Noir, too.
Incredible aging potential.
Yeah. Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris. We've even brought in Gruner Veltliner into the area over the last decade, and other white varieties, Pinot Blanc, etc. So white wines are one of the exciting areas. And did I mention Chardonnay? Chardonnay is exceptionally important, mainly because if we're looking at the European metaphor for the grape varieties that we grow, Pinot Noir, where's the mothership for that? That's Burgundy. How about the other great variety from Burgundy besides Pinot Noir? Chardonnay. Oh, way to go. We do grow some Auxerrois.
Well, there you go.
Our buddy Dave Adelsheim does. So it's vital that some of these grape varieties be recognized as doing very well in this same climate.
Sure. And how have you been involved as far as the impact for not only Chehalem wines but Willamette wines around the world? Do you have the opportunity to sort of to travel and like you have had whilst you've been in Australia to talk about Oregon wines?
Every time we have the opportunity to go abroad, plus also talk to writers who influence others, we definitely, maybe not without exception, but almost all of us spend a great deal of time not speaking about our brand exclusively, but speaking about Oregon and speaking about the Willamette Valley. It's important that we acknowledge and help the brand as a whole, the Oregon brand.
Sure.
Our own brand will follow. And I think personally, people recognize the region first, and then they recognize the people who do good jobs within that region. And I think probably the first part of doing a good job is understanding what sort of gift has been laid in your lap, and telling people about this great climate, this great place that we live in.
And do you think something that's been, a wonderful kind of symbiotic relationship of being so close to Portland is the kind of the really big interest in sustainable produce and sense of place as far as food and multiculturalism and really getting into the sort of food scene? Do you think that's been a really important part of the success of Willamette wines?
I think Portland's a very special place. It's always been special. I think it's really within the last 10 to 15 years that it has gained that sort of appreciation, probably worldwide. It's recognized for food, for anything you can drink, like craft beer, craft spirits,
sure.
Tea, you name it. Great coffee.
Coffee roasters, yeah. That's pretty. I'm sorry to say this, and this might be very controversial. The only place I had a really good cup of coffee was in Portland in my time in North America.
I don't doubt it. So I think Portland is very important today that way.
Sure.
During the formative years of the wine industry, I think it was less so.
Okay.
Some of the people in New York City would say yes to trying some of your wines before people in Portland would in the old days.
Wow, okay.
So there's a certain provinciality sometimes, and
so the wine market itself has changed in Portland. People are drinking more wine now than they were in the past.
Yeah.
Okay.
They are, and I think it's influenced a lot by the foodies of the world, some of whom live there, but a lot of people travel from one foodie market to another, and
sure.
Portland has gained a lot of that tourism, and some of that tourism comes out to wine country too.
And that certainly helps in telling the overall Oregon story.
Yeah, you bet. and it's a nice special place to be. At the same time, how can you beat Melbourne and having the access to the Yarra Valley and the Mornington Peninsula
Sure.
and Tasmania?
Yeah, and we've got some pretty nice restaurants here too,
Yeah.
and good coffee.
Yep, you bet. Yeah,
And you
I've
can't
hunted
have-
those down.
You can't have good wine without good food and good coffee, and good beer too.
You've got to have good beer during harvest. at
Absolutely.
least.
Well, Harry, I really do appreciate you sparing
it's
some
been
time.
my pleasure.
And of course, it was so wonderful to reconnect with you after
Yes.
so many years.
Come on back to Oregon.
Yeah, I
You
do.
gotta.
One of my lifetime goals is to absolutely come for the IPNC at one point. So I hope to see you there.
IPNC, International Peterson-Nedry Celebration. That's what I do.
Oh, no doubt. But thank you again.
You bet.
As always, thank you for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. If you did enjoy my chat with these three excellent Oregon-based winemakers, you can actually purchase the wine from the importer. They're all imported by the same company, Pinot Now. So get in contact with Steve Norton via the website, and he does retail through the website. So you can actually buy some of the excellent wines from these three producers, as well as a range of other really, really outstanding Oregon producers. If you'd like to follow me on social media, please hit me up on Twitter and Instagram. I am at Intrepid Wino, and you can also follow the podcast on Twitter. It's at the Vincast. If you visit me at facebook.com/Intrepid Wino, you'll find my Facebook page, so please hit that like button. And of course, you can follow me on YouTube. Head to YouTube channel Intrepid Wino, where you can see some of my tasting videos. Of course, I'd love for you to subscribe to the podcast, whether it's on iTunes or any other form of podcast hosting app or program. And if you do that, if you subscribe, then you can actually get the latest episode as soon as it becomes available, as well as leaving a rating and a review, as I mentioned at the start of this episode. All of that information, as always, is available at intrepidwino.com, so please come and visit me, get in contact, because I would love to get some of your feedback, like so many people have already. It's really great to hear from you. I hope to have you on next week's episode. I've got an absolute Australian icon winemaker, so stay tuned for that. But until then, bye.